All right, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to join us for one of our speaker series talks. And today it's my sincere pleasure to welcome two distinguished guests from the Atlantic Council, Dr. Rob Soofer and Dr. Mark Massa, for their talk titled, First We Will Defend the Homeland, the Case for Homeland Missile Defense, which is based on a recent report that both of them co-authored at the Atlantic Council. And I will put the link to their report in the chat so people can take a look at that as they're going through their remarks. But, you know, as we sort of all know, if we are interested in sort of missile defense and deterrence, missile defense is back in the news with the executive order that the president signed out about a new Iron Dome for America, which is now sort of retitled sort of Golden Dome for America. If you are unfamiliar with sort of how national security policy works, incoming administrations, they do a nuclear posture review, but they also do a missile defense review. And Dr. Soofer was deeply involved in that missile defense review in the previous Trump administration. So missile defense is back in the news. What should we do? How much money should we spend? We spent a long time sort of incrementally approaching missile defense, but there has been a push for a long time about sort of a great leap forward, and does technology enable us to do that? And if so, what will we defend against? Can we defend against everything? If we can't defend against everything, what do we defend against and what don't we defend against, and things like that? So, I mean, both of our speakers have a lot of experience in their topic. Their report goes into detail on these type of hard questions that people are now facing about missile defense. And so we're very fortunate to have them with us for what I think is a very timely talk. Let me say a little bit about the two speakers. You have their bios in the announcement, so I'll just say a few things about each of them. Dr. Rob Soofer is a non-resident senior fellow at the Forward Defense Program of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, where he leads the Nuclear Strategy Project. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches a class in nuclear strategy, missile defense, and arms control. He's a consultant at all three of the national laboratories in which we typically engage, as well as at the Institute for Defense Analyses. And he was Deputy Assistant Secretary. He's my former boss for defense, for nuclear missile defense policy from 2017 to January 2021. And previously, he served in the Senate as a professional staff member, Republican lead on the Subcommittee for Strategic Forces of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Dr. Massa is the Deputy Director for Strategic Forces Policy at the same program at the Atlantic Council. He's a founding member of that program. He does a lot of work on the management of that program, sort of strategy, budget, personnel, and impact. He's the lead on a lot of the portfolio of work on strategic forces issues, nuclear strategy, space security, missile defense, long-range conventional strike. He's written in a number of different publications and made appearances sort of all over the news on these topics. So two very, very deep speakers on this particular subject. Most of you know the ground rules. Most of you are frequent participants in CGSR things, but I'll just go over them again for people. So they're going to talk for about 30 to 45 minutes. They'll go through some slides. At any point in the conversation, you know, feel free to raise your hand electronically. Feel free to start typing your questions in the chat. I want to get as many people as I possibly can in this conversation, and sort of the earlier you get involved, that's the less time that I have to spend coming up with questions of my own, or you listening to my questions, because I really want to hear from your questions. So Rob, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I'm really excited about this, and I'm going to kick it over to you now.
Great, thank you, Mike. We'll put up the briefing slides. Again, it's a wonderful opportunity to be here. I am very anxious, in fact, to hear your views about how you think the lab might be able to participate in this new surge of interest for missile defense. And actually, we're not at the first slide here. Mark, are you controlling this? There you go.
You should put it in presentation mode.
Yeah. So let's start out with this funny title here. First, we will defend the homeland. This is a line, in fact, from the Biden National Defense Strategy. In fact, it's on the very first page. The point here is that for the Department of Defense, defending the homeland has always been the priority mission. And let me just let me just start out with a few top level thoughts before we get into the briefing. What led us to take a look at this the subject is that these threats to the homeland from missiles from Russia, China, and North Korea are in fact increasing. They figured out that U.S. vulnerability is something that needs to be exploited, and now allies are starting to wonder whether the United States would be willing to run risks on their behalf if we are not willing to protect ourselves against these threats. And the adversaries similarly would start to wonder. And so the main thesis of this study, if you will, is that by reducing the vulnerability of the homeland to these threats, it gives the president more options, and it mitigates adversary threats to the homeland that are meant to break our will, that are meant to coerce us, to get us to stand down from defending our vital interests. And this is key, that such a defense does not require a leak-proof Astrodome type architecture. We only need sufficient defenses necessary to defeat the adversary's purposes for these attacks. In other words, we have to eliminate the limited coercive threats and ensure that our nuclear forces can survive any combination of attackers. So those are the big ideas, and let's launch into this. First slide.
Sorry, Rob, can we stop you real quick? Mark, can you try to put the slides into presentation mode just so they're bigger on the screen? It's just the little sort of screen button down there on the right.
Yeah, they were. That's what it looks like on my side. So not sure if that's not sharing. But let me try something different.
Try it one more time. Just I want to make sure the slides are big and beautiful.
Yeah.
Big and beautiful, like our Golden Dome.
Like our Golden Dome. Yes.
All right. Is this better?
That looks perfect.
All right. My apologies.
All right. Next slide. So for those of you with little gray hair and not steep in this issue, the debate over missile defense has been probably one of the most emotional and heated debates since the very beginning of the nuclear age. This is a quote from Bernard Brodie, one of our founding fathers of nuclear strategy back in 1973, where he points out that the ABM question was emotional. So we are full aware that this is going to be a controversial issue, and we're happy to get into some of the arguments towards the end of this presentation. But we'd like to try to make the case for why we think homeland missile defense is necessary even today. Next slide, please. So let's start out by level setting everybody on what is our current missile defense policy. So with respect to defending our forces and our allies and our partners, we will do that against all missile threats from any adversary, right? Russia, China, regional threats, the full gamut of threats, and we will defend. And sometimes this is referred to as regional missile defenses or theater missile defenses, right? But when it comes to the homeland, our policy is somewhat bifurcated. We will defend the homeland against ballistic missile threats from North Korea and other rogues. We will defend the homeland against air and cruise missile attacks from any adversary, including Russia and China. But when it comes to defending the homeland against long-range ballistic missile attacks, ICBMs or SOBMs, we don't. It's not our policy actually to defend against those threats. We instead will rely on nuclear deterrence, i.e., the threat of retaliation, to defend the homeland against these threats. I would argue that this doesn't make much sense, and we'll explain why. Next chart, please. So the study objectives are to see whether we should expand the homeland defense mission to not only stay ahead of the North Korean ICBM threat, which is our current policy, but also to start countering Russian and Chinese limited coercive missile threats, right? And also to the extent that we believe that our nuclear forces may be vulnerable to a combined Russian and Chinese or a sequential Russian and Chinese preemptive disarming strike. Well, if we can use missile defenses to enhance the survivability of our forces, that contributes to deterrence. To the right of this, you see our consensus meter here. So in terms of defending against North Korea and other rogue states, provide a good, thick, comprehensive defense, stay ahead of it, I would argue that we're in the green there. There's pretty good consensus on that. though there are some members of Congress who are concerned that if we deploy too much defense against North Korea, you potentially upset so-called strategic stability with China and Russia. But we're also moving into this yellow or amber field here, where I'm starting to see some consensus on the policy requirement to defend against Russian and Chinese limited and coercive threats. In fact, the congressionally mandated Strategic Posture Commission report made this specific recommendation. Again, this was a bipartisan report. So I think that there's some appetite in the policy community, in the government community, to start looking at defending against these limited Russian and Chinese attacks. Should we protect our strategic nuclear forces against larger scale attacks? A disarming first strike could be over 1,000 missiles. Well, I'm not sure we're there yet. We haven't tested the proposition, but I think we can make a case for that. And finally, in the red, there is no agreement on whether or not we should protect the entire population against these missile threats. Whether that's possible or not, again, that's where I think the greatest level of debate occurs. Next slide, please. So our missile defense strategy is also well established. This is a slide of quotes from the Biden Missile Defense Review. And you'll see that the first objective of missile defense is to create doubt and uncertainty in the mind of the attacker, right? To complicate their strike plans so that they don't feel that they can use these offensive threats to coerce us or win in the region or on the battlefield, right? There's also another role for missile defense is to reassure our allies and partners, to give the president more military options, maybe less escalatory options. In fact, a wonderful example was the Iranian attacks against Israel. The fact that Israel was able to blunt those attacks meant that the Israeli government did not have to choose more escalatory options, such as a large-scale strike against Iran. So it provides more options, right? But I would draw your attention to number 6 here to make the point that missile defense and nuclear capabilities are complementary. We're not trying to replace deterrence with defense. We feel that a combination of deterrence and defense it provides the best way to mitigate or deter against these threats. In other words, you want to make it clear to the adversary that their attacks will be futile, but they're also going to be fatal because they can expect a costly response. Next slide. The notion that missile defense should be a foundation of U.S. strategy is not new. It goes back at least 20 years to the Department of Defense's Quadrennial Defense Review. And you see it says that defending the nation from attack is the foundation of strategy. As U.S. military has increased its power projection, adversaries have noted the vulnerability of the homeland. And so they're placing greater emphasis on capabilities to threaten the United States directly in order to counter our operational advantages, in order to counter our ability, right, to reinforce our allies. But to put it in plainer language, on the next slide, former Army Secretary Christine Wormuth said that, in a war with China or Russia, the homeland would be at risk, and the Chinese are going to go after the will of the United States public. They're going to try to erode the support for a conflict. And one of the key roles for missile defense, we believe, is to prevent this ability to break our will. Next slide. And again, the Missile Defense Review notes this and agrees with this concept. Missile defense systems, such as the ground-based mid-course defense system, that's our homeland missile defense system, offer a visible measure of protection for the U.S. population while reassuring allies and partners that the U.S. will not be coerced by threats to the homeland. In this case, from threats like North Korea and Iran. So you see, they apply this logic to North Korea and Iran, but they don't apply it to China and Russia. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark here to explain the three problem sets, which translate into three purposes for homeland missile defense. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. So as Rob mentioned, we're proposing through this study that U.S. Homeland Missile Defense Strategy keep pace with its current objective, which is a comprehensive defense against rogue state intercontinental attacks, and that's in light of North Korea's nuclear expansion, but then also that it take on 2 additional missions: protection against limited coercive attacks, which we'll define in a moment, from Russia or from China, as well as enhancing U.S. nuclear force survivability in the context of the 2 nuclear peer environment, which your colleagues at CGSR have done a leading role in explaining the consequences of to our community. Starting with North Korea, you can see here 2 quotes from senior military and defense officials expressing concern that North Korea's growing ICBM force is posing a threat to the U.S. Homeland, which may be outpacing the current and possibly planned defenses. And really, there are 2 reasons for this. Primarily, we're concerned about the increasing capabilities that the North has to bring to bear, but then also the alternatives to missile defense for addressing those capabilities are not especially attractive. In terms of the capabilities that are increasing, many of you are probably familiar with this, but to recap, North Korea's ICBMs are increasing in sophistication and range. There's some speculation and reporting from the US government and elsewhere that these missiles may be designed to carry multiple warheads, which would stress existing US defenses. We increasingly see them being road mobile and solid fueled, meaning they're much more difficult to destroy pre-launch, which is part of our plan for addressing North Korean nuclear threat. We see open source estimates of the total amount of fissile material that the North has, trending upward. And then we also see other enabling capabilities, everything from, TELs to other things increasing as well. So it's clear that the intercontinental range nuclear threat presented by the North is getting worse all the time. And who knows what the North Koreans are getting in exchange for their help to Russia in its ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine. The other concern is that the alternatives to missile defense for addressing the North Korean missile defense are problematic. The comprehensive missile defeat approach calls for offensive operations against North Korean missiles pre-launch to thin out the herd before our defenses would have to be taken into consideration in the event of attack. But there's always concerns about whether there be authorization to go after the missiles before launch. It's not clear that we'd be able to find any of them. We also see our South Korean allies increasing their capabilities and likely their intent to go after these missiles, hopefully in coordination with us, but possibly not entirely coordinated, which could lead to issues with escalation. All of this is a problem because U.S. allies are growing nervous about this. There's a quote here from the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, in which he calls attention after a North Korean ICBM test, not to the vulnerability of Japan, not to the vulnerability of U.S. bases in the region, but to the vulnerability of the entirety of the U.S. mainland, the U.S. homeland, and pointing out that the vulnerability of the U.S. is something that is degrading the extended deterrence pledges that we make to Japan, that we make to South Korea by extension. And of course, an important purpose of U.S. nuclear strategy, of U.S. grand strategy, is to extend deterrence to our allies so that they remain aligned with us, so that they are able to help us advance our foreign policy goals. And as such, our proposal, which we'll go into detail later on how we intend to actually carry it out, is to make sure that U.S. homeland missile defenses do keep pace with this expanding threat, in addition to improvements to the comprehensive missile defeat approach. Now, as Rob mentioned, that's probably the least controversial part of the report and the smallest departure from the current strategy. What we also propose in the report is an expansion of the strategy to include protection against the limited coercive missile strikes from Russia and China. Now, what do we mean by that? What is a limited coercive missile strike? Well, it's limited in its number and it's coercive in its purpose. These could be ballistic missiles, conventionally armed or nuclear armed. They could be cruise missiles launched off of bombers or submarines. And what we're not talking about here is, thousands of missiles launched at every city in the country. We're talking about a handful. And the targets of these strikes, wouldn't necessarily be, downtowns of cities, but would be key military and civilian infrastructure. On the military infrastructure part, that's a little bit easier to explain. As you know, the great bulk of our force posture is here in the United States in order to defend our allies or reclaim their territory in the event of a major power conflict. We would need to flow forces from the U.S. overseas. And our adversaries know that there's really only a handful of facilities, ports, rail yards, the like, that we would use to gather our forces and start to send them overseas. And they might think that if they could hold some of these key defense nodes at risk, they could defeat our ability, or at least delay our ability, to reinforce our allies, and therefore really defeat the entire defense strategy. They may believe that if they can get away with that, they could achieve a fait accompli, perhaps threaten to escalate and lock in gains. We can't have this. It was making our allies nervous, and it's an increasing threat to our strategy. And so we have to find a way to deter or defeat these attacks. And we submit that limited preferential missile defense around key military nodes is one way to do this, among other options. The other part of this limited coercive missile threat is against really where the target isn't so much the specific target that's being hit, but the target is U.S. national will to continue a fight. And the goal of these strikes then would be to impose consequences directly on the U.S. Populace to cause their support for a potential conflict to disappear. Things in this target set might include power generation, water treatment, the other things that make civilian life possible to continue thriving. And this is a much wider target set. But we do see in the quotes here concern that this is a target set that our adversaries would go after. So what's the purpose of missile defenses to address these threats? Clearly, there are thousands of civilian sites all over the country. There are many military sites. What we're not proposing is to defend every single one of them, which would essentially be a comprehensive defense of the country, but rather to defeat our adversary strategy. And there are essentially four ways of doing this. The first is the actual benefit of the defense. There are sites that we would be able to defend against a certain level of attack that could protect or at least extend our ability to continue our military operations, to flow forces, to reinforce our allies. Knowing this, our adversaries might be deterred from beginning the conflict in the first place. But really, the key point here is that we're defeating the adversary's strategy by making it difficult for them to calibrate the likelihood of success of their attack and the degree of coercive pain that they intend to inflict. The way we do this is we introduce at least three risks into the Russian or Chinese attack planner. The first, the most obvious, is the risk of attack failure. They launch an attack on us, our defenses succeed. All of a sudden, they've managed to indicate that they're willing to go after our homeland, but they've not actually achieved the military effect that they want. Our operations can continue. They've demonstrated a level of escalation, and so they're going to bring on consequences without achieving results. The second risk that they take on is the risk of perception that an incoming attack is not limited or not as limited as they want to signal. Imagine they want to take out 10 targets, but those targets have a limited preferential defense. If they want to take out those 10 targets, they all of a sudden have to send in a force package, not only to defeat those targets, but also to defeat or degrade the defenses so that they can get through. So maybe they're sending in 100 weapons. All of a sudden, all the president knows, all the commander knows when they look on the screen is not that there are 10 things that are about to be struck, but there are 100 incoming missiles. We might not know exactly what they're going. We definitely don't know the adversary's intent. And so, the decision on how to respond and retaliate is based on the idea of 100 incoming weapons and not 10 destroyed targets. The adversary, probably knows this, and now they have this problem where they can't necessarily, they lose confidence that their attack is going to be perceived as limited. So that might lead them to, not try it in the first place. The corollary is that is a third risk, the risk of over success. They might send in a force package believing that it'll be degraded by a certain percent and hit a certain number of targets. And then our defenses might not work as well as expected or as well as the adversary expects. We might choose to not defend certain sites because we want to hold our defenses in reserve for other targets. And then all of a sudden, the adversary has inflicted an amount of pain that is greater than what they were counting on, and they're going to have to deal with a level of retaliation that is more than what they bargained for. So all of a sudden, between these three risks, an adversary goes from essentially having a free ride into attacking, whatever target they want in the homeland, with the exception of the areas we already have defended around the capital, a national capital region, to having to do this really difficult calculation of how their attack is going to be perceived, what their success rate is going to be, and whether the retaliation they're going to get is going to be worth the effect that they're going to generate. And the reason that this is important is because it means that we can defeat the adversary strategy with a finite amount of defense. It's not that we have to have more and more defense for every incoming missile or every site that's added to the list. It's enough defense to complicate the adversary's attack planning, therefore defeating the strategy of a limited course of attack. And of course, the actual benefits of the defense are nice on top of that. Two other benefits that are more straightforward. Of course, if you have defenses, it is a visible assurance to our allies that we have their back, that we're willing to protect ourselves, and therefore we're more likely to come to their aid. And as Rob mentioned at the outset, if our defenses do succeed, it could offer a less escalatory option and provide room for off-ramps. And as the Strategic Posture Commission quote below says, the current program of record is not sufficient to defend against this threat set. Moving on to the third category of threats that we propose we expand homeland missile defense to deal with is this idea of protecting our nuclear retaliatory forces in light of the two nuclear peer plus environment that we are facing. As those on this call, I'm sure, are tracking, China is in the midst of a nuclear breakout. It is increasing both the quality and the quantity of its nuclear forces. By the 2030s. It will pose a significant counterforce threat to significant elements of our U.S. nuclear forces. And then, of course, we have to deal not just with the threat of one of these nuclear peers at a time, but also the possibility of a simultaneous attack in the worst case scenario, or perhaps more likely a sequential conflict where we would need to deter one power even when we're in a limited exchange with the other. And, at the bottom there, you'll see that U.S. Strategic Command is concerned about the survivability of some of its nuclear forces, and protecting them against the threats is an important mission. So how can we enhance the survivability of our forces in light of the two nuclear peer challenge? Well, the recipe for doing so maybe hasn't changed all that much since the last time we faced such a threat in the days of the Cold War. You can increase the number of offensive forces that you have so that more survive any attack. You can harden the existing forces so it takes more incoming adversary warheads to destroy them. Or, as you see there in the middle, and as we're proposing through this study, you can defend a certain portion of the forces so that it takes a higher expected amount of damage to destroy them, and also degrades your adversary's confidence that they'll be able to fully destroy them. And this is a quote from President Nixon's document in the 70s, showing that maybe perhaps the more things change, the more they stay the same. All right, so what are the goals of defending against an adversary, combined adversary attack or sequential adversary attack on U.S. nuclear forces? Well, again, a key goal is to create attacker uncertainty, similar to the limited coercive set. If you're going to go for a large-scale counterforce strike, you want to be pretty sure you're going to succeed. Introducing a measure of defenses would make it more likely that we'd be able to still inflict unacceptable damage, even if an adversary attempted this. The second purpose to ensure that U.S. nuclear forces can endure and retaliate is maybe more likely in a sequential scenario. If your forces are slowly being expended or slowly being degraded in a conflict with one, having some measure of defenses left is a signal to the second peer, the potential third man in, that you maintain a sufficient reserve of forces that is protected, such that you can deter that third adversary and continue to have a deterrent posture following the resolution of the first conflict at the lowest possible level of damage. What do we actually plan to defend to make this possible? Well, the first thing is nuclear command control and communications. Extremely important for those assets to be able to survive. Many of them are mobile and survivable. Some of them are fixed. Having a measure of defenses could increase that potential weak link. Submarines and the bombers are survivable when they are dispersed, but they're not especially survivable when they're in port, when they're on bases. There are plenty of dispersal sites that we might want to make more survivable. So that's those are some places we would suggest to defend. And then, of course, the ICBM silos, they are hardened, but they are also very close together, meaning that one defensive asset could potentially have a footprint to cover multiple sites and give you some leverage there. So I will stop there and turn it back to Rob, who is going to go through the rest of our slides, talking about the objectives of our defense and a little bit about the design that we propose to do so. Back to you, Rob.
Thanks, Marco. In about 10 minutes, I want to explain. Well, let me first say that this was meant to be a policy strategy study. Why it makes sense to deploy this capability. We decided also to look at what kind of defenses would be needed. But again, my caveat here is that this requires a considerable amount of technical expertise and maybe some modeling and simulation that was not inherent in this particular study. But if you're building a missile defense system, whether it's Iron Dome or what have you, you have to ask the question: is what is the objective for the missile defense system? Right? That's always the first question. Is it an Astrodome impenetrable defense of people, or is it something less than that? Because depending on your objectives, your requirements, and thus the technological requirements and the cost are affected commensurately. So for us, we think the key here is we're trying to enhance deterrence, which means creating uncertainty in the mind of the attacker. As Mark went through it, will their limited strikes work? Will the limited strikes be perceived as too large? Could the adversary, contemplate a disarming first strike? Again, to the extent that you magnify uncertainty, you magnify doubt, this fosters hesitation and caution and bolsters deterrence. So the objective here, again, is to create uncertainty, not to provide comprehensive homeland protection. Next slide, please. So it's probably going to be helpful to think about the scale of the attacks. Again, this is all very notional, but if you're looking at defending against the rogue threats, say North Korea, what have you, we're looking at several dozen. I think that there is no unclassified U.S. government number for the amount of North Korean ICBM launchers. But last time I checked, there was a parade that had about 11 or so, but maybe they're up to 20, but we don't know for sure. So we're figuring about several dozen. At the high end, if Russia or China were to launch a disarming first strike against the United States, they would need to fire at least 1,000 missiles, right, to go after 400 ICBM silos and the few bomber and submarine bases and nuclear command and control. So you're looking at a larger strike, but then still not thousands of nuclear warheads. And the third category, the protection against limited coercive threats, that's probably the most difficult to gauge, because it could be a small number, say 10 ICBM warheads, could be maybe 30 hypersonic glide vehicles, and it could be 100 or 2 cruise missiles launched from aircraft or from submarines. But just it's going to give you a notion for the type of threat sizes we're interested in. Next slide, please. So you may not be aware of this, but today the U.S. homeland is protected by a single layer of defense. These are the 44 ground-based interceptors that we have deployed in Alaska and California. And as this chart shows, the threat starts out on the left. We've got space sensors that tell you that the threat is on its way. We have forward-based radars in the ground that start tracking the threat. We have a sea-based radar in the Pacific that starts to discriminate the real warheads from the decoys. And then we have a large land-based radar. It's called a long-range discrimination radar in Alaska that does sort of the final tracking and discrimination, and the interceptors take off from the United States. But essentially, this is a terrestrial-based single layer of defense. The goal has always been, with respect to the Missile Defense Agency, at least, to deploy a layered missile defense system. But we don't actually have that today. But we could have something like that within the next few months, if not a couple of years. Next slide, please. We have today regional missile defense capabilities that could perform a homeland missile defense role. So for instance, in this particular slide here, you'll see the threat comes in from the left, and you can try to take a couple of shots against the threat using the ground-based mid-course defense system with our ground-based interceptors. But you can also try to shoot it down with our sea-based missile defense system called the Standard Missile 3. In fact, in November of 2020, the Navy, with Missile Defense Agency support, actually successfully intercepted a mock North Korean ICBM. And there were plans laid in at the end of the first Trump administration to actually integrate the SM-3-2A missile and the THAAD, which is a terminal defense capability, but to integrate these two into the defense of the homeland. So you would have at least these three layers, right? The GMD system, then the Aegis system, and then finally the THAAD system. This is something that could be done fairly quickly. We just need to buy more interceptors and do the integration. As an emergency capability, you can certainly have Aegis ships located off the west coast of the United States in the appropriate location, which could take another shot at an incoming North Korean ICBM. Next slide. Again, the benefits of layered defense are at least two. One is it increases the efficiency. So if you have three layers that are each one is 80% effective, and if they're truly independent layers, you now have a combined defensive probability of kill of over 99%, right? And so if you don't have a layered defense, if there are 200 incoming missiles, let's assume that our firing doctrine for our ground-based interceptor is 3-to-1 today, you would need 600 interceptors. If you had a layered defense, you could potentially do this mission with about 250 interceptors. So it makes your system more efficient, but it also increases uncertainty in the attacker. They may think they may be able to penetrate one layer, but in fact, the second layer or the third layer may be impervious to the countermeasures that they deploy to get through the first layer. So again, the key here is a layered missile defense system. We've understood the benefits for a long time. We just haven't executed on it. Next slide, please. What are sort of the attributes for the next generation system? Well, you have to have global tracking and discrimination, which means you have to go to space. You need sensors in space that can track the threat and can also help you discriminate the decoys and the countermeasures from the real system, the real warheads. You need to have a layered defense. It would be helpful if the defense was survivable and resilient against attack. Well, let's go to the next slide. We haven't said anything about cruise missile defense, but this is a key part of defending the homeland. In fact, if you were to ask U.S. Northern Command, which is the alligator closest to the boat, they'll say it's cruise missile defense, because today Russia and China both have cruise missiles that can be launched by aircraft or ships and pose threats to our critical infrastructure. And this is a study done by CSIS. And they found that, look, you don't have to protect the entire country, but if you had 5 key areas in the United States, and you notice that most of these are on the coast related to potentially our ports of embarkation, you could, if you were to develop, say, 5 preferential defense areas, all you would need to do is build the sensing capability to see the threat coming. These are over the horizon radars, and then combine that with existing interceptors such as Patriot, the NASAM, the AIM-9 missiles, things that we use today already to shoot down cruise missiles. If you can see the threat coming in, you can target it. The Air Force has been assigned the executive agent for Homeland Cruise Missile Defense. NORTHCOM has put together a plan. The problem is that we've been unwilling as a nation to afford this level of protection. Next slide. So again, to summarize real quick, we need to stay ahead of the North Korean threat. We need to deploy a layered defense system to thwart Russian and Chinese coercive strikes. We can enhance the survivability of U.S. nuclear forces through a layered preferential defense. We have to take care of the cruise missile threat. Everything that I just mentioned right now is more or less based on existing state-of-the-art missile defense technology. But we have to make the transition to the next generation systems, which means better space-based sensors, potentially space-based interceptors, and being able to shoot down the threats in the boost phase using directed energy or, surface or air-to-air missiles deployed on bombers, high-altitude UAVs, or perhaps fighter aircraft. Next slide. All right, this is our get off the stage slide. Just to remind you, the threat is growing. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The problem is that adversaries are trying to deter our power projection, right, to weaken our alliances. That's why they would employ these threats. U.S. vulnerability is making our allies nervous, and the consequence of that is they'll become less good allies. They'll either accommodate to the threat or they'll develop their own nuclear capabilities. Therefore, protecting the homeland is critical for U.S. credibility and influence. It's a way of accomplishing the bumper sticker of peace through strength, if you will. The key point that we want to make is less than perfect defenses are adequate. They undermine the purpose of the attacks. They prevent that coercion that we're trying to avoid. In order to accomplish this, though, you still need to have a layered defense in the near term with the ground-based interceptor, the SM-3 and the THAAD, which already exists. We just need more of them. But to make a transition to the next generation of systems and truly to stay ahead of the more sophisticated Russian and Chinese threats, which have better countermeasures, better decoys, we're going to have to go to space. We're going to have to demonstrate space-based interceptors, if that's the way we want to go, and other boost phase defenses as well. And of course, the big question that I get is, well, Rob, how much is this going to cost? Well, today we spend about a third of 1% of the defense budget on homeland missile defense. Again, that's a third of 1%. So the Missile Defense Agency budget is about $10 billion. The amount of money spent on the ground-based mid-course defense system and the next generation interceptor and the sensors that all contribute to it, it's about $3.5 billion. That's about a third of the Missile Defense Agency budget, but it's a third of 1% of the entire DoD budget. If we would just go to 1% of the DoD budget, this would mean adding about $4, $5, maybe $6 billion a year for missile defense. And I think we would go a long way to achieving the recommendations in this report. So with that, I'll stop talking, and I look forward to your questions. But more importantly, if you have some comments about how you think the lab might be able to help us on this, and I'm sure they're playing a role in the execution of the executive order. Again, over to you. Thank you.